I want to thank both Dan and Maria and the entire team behind Civics of Technology for doing all the work to gather us here today. So this is the first conference where I'm presenting alongside student researchers in the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, which makes this actually really extra special for me. I hope some of you had a chance to attend the session right before this, in which we heard from the immigration team. Tomorrow, there are 3 other panels that you can learn more about the work that they've been doing all summer in the Tech Freedom School. A huge shout out to Sierra Robeson, Associate Director of the Just Data Lab, for shepherding us towards these conference sessions, and to all of the team leaders for your energy and dedication all summer. So for those of you who've heard me talk before, you know that I usually start with this line by Toni Cade Bambara, a Black feminist writer, in which she cautions, not all speed is movement. This point, I think, can be applied to so many areas of our lives where we're racing after something, whether it's personal, professional. Bambara's words remind us, when we think about it in light of technological speed and the race to market, that market logics are not synonymous with social progress, that technology can just as well reflect and reproduce social inequity if we fail to slow down and consider the deadly fault lines that animate everyday life. As we see here, robotic police dogs are proposed as a desirable method of patrolling our cities, patrolling our borders, a more humane and cost-effective option, we are told. This is the future, which the powers that be are envisioning. So what would slowing down to carefully assess this or any technology as a starting point for envisioning just futures? For starters, I think it means looking beyond the shiny high-tech surfaces, not falling for the marketing hype, and instead critically assessing the social and political environments in which tech fixes for social problems are proposed. Not all speed is movement is a reminder that innovation often leads to new forms of containment and social and racial control, like more high-tech policing at a time when basic things like quality housing, education, healthcare, and work are hard to come by. It requires us to ask, with Mariam Kaba, what else can we grow instead of punishment and suffering? What else can we grow? We have healthcare policies neglecting the needy, education policies breeding ignorance, labor policies producing disposable people, housing policies building scarcity, environmental policies ensuring our extinction, and tech policies encoding inequity, all by design. But we can and must design otherwise. So how? This is the question, of course, that keeps me up at night and continues to animate my work. And while the first 3 books shown here, People Science, Race After Technology, and Captivating Technology, focused more on the policies, the practices, and pedagogies that we need to transform. My forthcoming book, Viral Justice, explicitly engages the role of poetry, or a poetics of the future, which I think of as the creative work of world building, often in seemingly small, inconsequential ways, but which is just as essential as those other P's. And since our theme here is visioning the future, I thought I would kick things off by reciting a passage from a poetic essay that I teach every year, titled Technology and Ethos, written by Amiri Baraka in 1969. And someone can actually find the PDF online and drop it in the chat for folks to access. So before I read the passage, I just want to show here Baraka dancing a traditional African right dance with Maya Angelou on a beautiful tile floor that sits atop the buried ashes of Langston Hughes at the Schomburg Museum in Harlem in 1991. So this image is oozing with Black poetic possibility. So now to the essay. Again, it was written in 1969, over 20 years before this photo was taken, where Baraka offers a vision of the future. He writes, machines are an extension of their inventors, creators. Machines, the entire technology of the West is just that, the technology of the West. Nothing has to look or function the way it does, he says. The West man's freedom, unscientifically got at the expense of the rest of the world's people, has allowed him to expand his mind, spread his sensibility wherever it could go, and so shape the world and its powerful artifact engines. 1969. Political power is also the power to create, he writes, not only what you will, but to be free to go wherever you can go, mentally, physically as well. Black creation, creation powered by the Black ethos, brings very special results, Baraka contends. Think of yourself, Black creator, freed of European restraint, which first means the restraint of self-determined mind development. Think what would be the results of the unfettered blood inventor creator with the resources of a nation behind him, to imagine, to think, to construct, to energize. How do you communicate with the great masses of Black people? How do you use the earth to feed masses of people? How do you cure illness? How do you prevent illness? What are the Black purposes of space travel? Baraka asks. It staggers the mind. To be free, go let the mind do what it will, a constructive, progressive force, availed of the total knowledge, resource, energy of a nation. These white scientists on lifetime fellowships or pondering problems at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. That's Baraka talking, which of course, that's my favorite line. So that a telephone is one culture's solution to the problem of sending words through space. It is political power that has allowed this technology to emerge and seem the sole direction for the result desired. A typewriter. Why should it only make use of the tips of the fingers as contact points of flowing, multi-directional creativity? If I invented a word placing machine, an expression scriber, if you will, then I would have a kind of instrument into which I could step and sit or sprawl or hang and use not only my fingers to make words express feelings, but elbows, feet, head, behind, and all the sounds I wanted, screams, grunts, taps, itches, I'd have magnetically recorded at the same time and translated into word. Or perhaps even the final expressed thought, feeling would not be merely word or sheet, but itself, the expression, three-dimensional, able to be touched or tasted or felt or entered or heard or carried, like a speaking, singing, constantly communicating charm. A typewriter is corny, Baraka exclaims. The so-called fine artist realizes, those of us who have freed ourselves, that our creations need not emulate the white man's, but it is time the engineers, architects, chemists, electronics craftsmen, that is film too, radio, sound, etc., that learning Western technology must not be the end of our understanding of the particular discipline we're involved in. Again, 1969. Most of that West-shaped information is like mud and sand when you're panning for gold, Baraka enjoins. The actual beginnings of our expression are post-Western, just as they certainly are pre-Western. It is only necessary that we arm ourselves with complete self-knowledge. The whole technology, which is, after all, just expression of whoever, will change to reflect the essence of a freed people, freed of an oppressor. But also, as Toure has reminded, we must be free from the oppressor's spirit as well. It is this spirit as emotional construct that can manifest as expression, as art or technology or any form. But what is our spirit? What will it project? What machines will it produce? What will they achieve? What will be their morality? Check the different morality of the Chinese birthday celebration firecracker and the white boy's bomb. Machines have the morality of their inventors, Baraka says. See everything fresh and without form, then make forms that will express us truthfully and totally, and by this certainly free us eventually. The new technology must be spiritually oriented because it must aspire to raise man's spirituality and span man's consciousness. It must begin by being humanistic, he writes, though the white boy has yet to achieve this. Witness a technology that kills both plants and animals, poisons the air, and degenerates or enslaves man. The technology itself must represent human striving. It must represent at each point the temporary perfection of the evolutional man and be obsolete only because nothing is ever perfect. The only constant is change. So wrote Amiri Baraka over 50 years ago, visioning just futures. So now let me connect this poetics to visioning civics of technology and just futures today. As I do, I want you to let Baraka's words sink in and reverberate as we look at some of the ways that technology is now deployed to capture and contain, to rank and file away human beings, even as tech boosters promise that they make life better, more efficient, as with these algorithms that grade SATs and have many issues, as with the A-level algorithms that graded students at the beginning of the pandemic and predictably sorted students from lower income schools having lower grades, predicting them having lower grades, and more elite institutions, higher grades. So with healthcare algorithms that fail to treat Black patients the same as their white counterparts in terms of allocating resources and care. As with the promises of greener technology, many people don't realize that training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetime. So we have to question the rhetoric, the marketing, the promises surrounding all of these tools. And in doing so, I want to suggest that there are 2 dominant stories that we tell and are told about technologies. The first is what we might call the techno-dystopian narrative, that technologies are going to slay us. They're going to remove human agency. They're going to take all the jobs, where everything negative associated with the rise of the robots, as it were. And of course, this is the narrative that Hollywood loves to sell us, the Terminator, the Matrix, and the list goes on. On the other end of the spectrum is the narrative, what we might call the techno-utopian story, that technology is going to save us. All of those promises from the previous slides, more fair, more efficient, more green. If only we would hand over major decisions to our digital handmaidens. And of course, this is the narrative that Silicon Valley works 24 hours, 7 days a week to sell us. And while these seem like opposing narratives, right? They have different endings, one in which we're slayed, one in which we're saved. They have a shared logic, what we might call a techno-deterministic logic, in which technology is in the driver's seat and we are impacted by it, either harmed or helped. And so one of the first things we have to do to pull back the screen and create a civics of technology, to vision just futures, is to reject both ends of that narrative, to really identify and think about the human agents and agencies that are currently behind the screen, that are materializing their limited imagination in our digital and physical infrastructures as a first step to explode that terrain, to invite many different kinds of imaginaries into the space that can then be materialized. And so this is in one way to think about what it means to tell 3rd, 4th, and 5th stories about our relationship between society and technologies that can begin to open up this space. When we think historically, those narratives fall into predictable grids. When we think about so-called deadly data, we look to something like the Nazi regime and their collection and production of data as a precursor to exterminating populations with these punch card technologies. We know that IBM was instrumental in that process. And in this case, one of the things to realize is this huge tragedy and huge genocide relied on everyday people to clock in and out, to put their heads down, to do their jobs, to punch those cards and collect those data and not ask any questions, not think about why that data was being collected and to what ends. It's what one observer called a bureaucracy of evil. So the question for us becomes, what ways is this taking shape today? The students in the last session on immigration talked about the role of data and ICE and immigration and justice. And so we can think about the bureaucracies of evil that shape life today and how we shouldn't put our heads down and just crunch those numbers and do what we're told. Bringing it to our presence, we have a different framing now, right? The marketing has changed. And so we want to think about how buzzwords like community, like innovation, actually can hide forms of harm and surveillance and policing and containment under the hood of feel-good rhetoric. In this case, a project out of St. Paul, Minnesota, in which the police department joined forces with the public school system to create the innovation project. And the idea was to produce a data sharing platform that would be kind of an early alert system to identify, quote, at-risk youth in the city, right? This do-gooding interventionist idea. And very quickly, as soon as the communities there got wind of it, they rallied around in order to put a stop to it and pointing to, actually, let's look at this data. Where is this data coming from? Suspension records, attendance records, whether kids are involved with child protective services, whether their families are involved in the criminal legal system. And, community members said, well, all of the institutions where you're getting this data, none of them have ever helped us. None of them have ever worked in our best interest. Why now, under the hood of a community innovation project, should we trust? Should we believe magically that it's going to be put to different ends in this stigmatizing label of at risk? And so they work together in town halls, a civics of technology, in workshops, in popular education, and over the course of about a year, they put an end to the community innovation project. But they didn't just put an end to it. They said, give us the resources that you are going to pour into this thing and let us decide how to channel these funds and what kinds of supports, what kinds of community building, what actually serve our young people. And so again, abolition, abolere, is to destroy and to grow. That's the etymology, to destroy and to grow. We need to know what we want to end to, clearly, and we want to know what we want more of. So that's why that visioning exercise at the beginning of the conference was so important. Because if we can't name both what we want to get rid of and name what we want more of, it's harder to organize around it and materialize that imagination. And so again, part of the process involves developing a shared vocabulary to name what's harming us and what will help us, rather than just downloading the marketing of, the Silicon 6 or 7 or however many they are now. And so reading our social reality, connecting the dots, understanding things at an individual level, at an interpersonal level, at an institutional level, and understanding how these things relate is part of this critical digital literacy, is what some people call critical digital pedagogy. I would invite you to look at the edited volume that's available, again, for free download online, or you can donate. So if someone could find the link to the critical digital pedagogy text and put it in the chat, I think that those essays are really helpful, as well as so many of the other resources that have been mentioned throughout the sessions today and tomorrow. And so for me, my entry into trying to name the reality that I saw sort of taking shape around me was initially very kind of simple recognition that the way that our popular rhetoric was framing these harms in terms, as you see here, the robots as sexist or racist, was through, just engaging the news media and thinking about how this language, again, often attributed to the technology, the source of the harm, where the actors behind the scenes were sometimes hidden from the scripts, hidden from the process. And so part of that naming process for me was thinking about this continuity between past and present harms. And so thinking about the Jim Crow era, the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander put it, and then in this case, the new Jim Code, thinking about how coded bias and imagined objectivity work together to produce new forms of digitally mediated or tech mediated containment. And under this larger concept, I've been thinking and written about the different forms this takes, from the most obvious types, engineered inequity, where it's quite obvious that this tool or technique or technology is being used to create hierarchies and discrimination, to the more implicit forms, a subtler variety, often framed in ways that supposedly help us. And so that takes us along this spectrum. And so in the time remaining, I'm just going to highlight these last two with some examples, looking at ed tech in particular, thinking about the educational space, and then what people are already doing about it, which inspires me. So that idea of coded exposure is trying to name this relationship between being invisible or invisibilized through various technologies and being hyper visible. And so in this case, where you're not seen, in this case, where you're centered in a way that's harmful, in which you haven't chosen to be. And so I think when we understand, these two ends, we can understand that sometimes things that come under the rhetoric of inclusion, diversity and inclusion, can actually take the form of being a kind of predatory inclusion. And one example that comes to mind, a few years ago, when Google was reckoning with a lot of the research that Joy Buolamwini and colleagues were doing around the invisible side, they said, okay, well, we want our new phone to be able to recognize people with darker skin. We want this to expand our market. We don't want to limit our market. And so what they did was they hired contract workers to approach Black people in Atlanta and a few other cities. And specifically, the contract workers were directed to approach unhoused people in Atlanta and have them play with the app on the phone in order to take their photo, so that it could populate the training data with darker skinned people, so that it would work better on a wide variety of phenotypes. And the contract workers were the ones who blew the whistle. They went to the media and they said, something is wrong with this setup. And what I think the real red flag was, they were told not to tell the individuals whose faces they were capturing in the photos what the purpose of that was. They were told to give them $5 gift cards and take this photo, play with this game. And so for me, when I think about how that came to be, in light of, we were already in the midst of this, the tech lash, or growing awareness about the harms of big tech, what was that boardroom or that design room, that decision-making process? Who was in that room? What perspectives were being shared? Was it a very homogenous room, whether racially and economically, disciplinarily, where people didn't even know about the long history of scientific experimentation on vulnerable populations, on Black Americans in particular? If they knew about it, did they feel comfortable raising their hand and saying, this is going to go sideways? And if they did, were those comments or were those reflections dismissed? And so there's all of these steps in which I think about how the insides of tech companies and the outsides, the civic impact of their work, that relationship between what happens in those rooms and then how those harms are enacted. And I think for me, one of the main problems with this particular example of Google's, this image capturing, was that the very people who were being asked to diversify, this training data, they were being included in this very predatory way, would be the same people who this facial recognition these tools would be used to police and surveil and get out of public space and get out of stores. And so you can be included on one end, and those very tools can come back and be weaponized against you. And so that's why I think we have to be very mindful and critical about the way that in diversity and inclusion rhetoric is deployed in our institutions, in academia and elsewhere. So again, now let's think about this in the context of ed tech. On the invisible side, here's a study from a few years ago that was looking on online classes and found, what they did was they looked at instructors' responses to students. And looking at 124 online classes, found that instructors are 94% more likely to respond to white male students than their counterparts. And so this is what we might think of the being outside of the frame, not being visible. And then the hyper visible side comes when we think about proctoring software. And yes, we know that facial recognition often is not working well, but students in this case were asked to shine a bright light on their faces to aid the machine to detect them with greater precision. And so here is one student's comment. Miguel says, it's not just about the racial bias, there's the unaccountable data collection that damaged the student-teacher relationship, which I think is really important, because you can make this technology work better and detect everyone well, but that data on the backside will still be bought and sold and used in ways that people haven't consented to. And so we have to look at both what's happening in front of the screen and behind it as we critically assess these tools. Also, as Jennifer Buckley here says, an engineering professor at Delaware, she, in response to this proctoring software, she says, no, thank you. I'd rather my students not feel like they're in a police state. And so when we all shifted to remote a few years ago, there was one institution in particular, there may have been more, Michigan State, I believe, that opted out, that said, no, we're not going to ramp up proctoring software, and we're going to invest in all of the ways to actually support our student and faculty needs. So this is what we might think of as authentic assessment, investing in people and not proctoring. And so we have a great example of an institution trying to do things differently. And so when we think about that last concept on that list under the new Jim Code, what comes to mind is a lot of these tools that go under the label of student success predictors. Again, the idea being, let's intervene early, like that St. Paul example, to identify the high-risk students so we can funnel more resources. More than 500 universities across the country use Navigate's risk algorithms to evaluate their students. And for a deeper dive, check out this markup and just follow the markup in general if you're not already, whether on Instagram or their website. They're doing some really great investigative work. And so this article in particular, it looks at the disparities in how the software treats students of different races. And the disparities particularly start for Black students who are deemed high risk at quadruple the rate. And so, one way to think about this, one way I think about it is that so many of these tools that one might have this kind of benevolent framing, individualize the problems and make it seem as if the risk is emanating from the students or from the individuals, that there's something inherent that makes people risky, rather than looking at how and what is producing the risk in the first place, the environmental, the social, political context. And so, we might imagine redeploying this tool and envisioning a just future, perhaps as a parody, perhaps in reality, in which we predict the risk of different departments, the risk that they produce. And so rather than individualize the problem, let's institutionalize it and look at how different fields, different disciplines, different institutions are producing risk for students, rather than looking at students as the site of risk, or in any context, how the most vulnerable people or populations in a given context are the source of risk. Rather than looking at renters, let's look at landlords. Rather than looking at people who are standing trial, let's look at judges. And so it's a way of looking up at how power is being exercised, so that if we're going to develop digital tools, let's deploy them in a way that actually challenges the power relationships, rather than simply trying to make individuals help them navigate these hostile systems with greater ease. And so what does that look like? It looks like, again, knowing what we're against and knowing what we're for, listening to learners in the context of ed tech. Here we had a few years ago, Brooklyn students walking out because their school had adopted a software program developed by Facebook, in which they essentially had like 10 or 15 minutes of FaceTime with a teacher every week. And they decided, okay, this individualized and tailored learning is not what we signed up for. We don't consider this good education. And so they took matters into their own hands and staged a walkout. Similarly, in a small town in Kansas, the entire school system had adopted the Summit Learning program, and was having all kind of debilitating effects on students with disabilities, on low-income students. And so here, the parents, the students, and perhaps some of the teachers also pushed back against this and went to the school board and said, get this thing out of our schools. And so again, this is about naming and challenging the way that technology is being deployed in one particular context. And we're seeing similar kinds of rebellion in many other social arenas as well. So in naming what we want, one way to frame, if we don't want proctoring, if we don't want surveillance in our classes, what are pedagogies of educational dignity look like? And so one of the essays from Critical Digital Pedagogy, which I mentioned earlier, says, it's about recognizing the power of students to read the world, make meaning, and act with intention and efficacy. So our job as educators become creating the space and the resources for students to do just that. And so, which brings me to, I'm not going to talk about the Just Data Lab with greater depth. I'm going to ask actually Sierra, if she's on the line, to drop a link to a video recording for anyone who wants like a deep dive into how the lab started and the different iterations it's taken and our visions for the future, and to hear from some of the students. We have a video recording of a workshop that we did earlier this summer that you can check out. And if she's not on the line, I'll be sure to drop it in the chat when we're done. But in any case, one of the things I want to point out, which might seem like, what's the point of this? But I wanted to note that one of our main sponsor is the Office of Information Technology at the university, which is like the office that deals with like Canvas and like the more things that are kind of like the boring technical side of running a university. And part of the outcome, I think, of the uprisings, the George Floyd uprisings, was that departments and units that had once thought, oh, that's an African American studies thing, or that's a critical race thing over there, like it's not relevant to them. They realize, no, it's relevant to everyone. The work that we're doing when we're talking about visioning just futures, when we're talking about civics of technology, it's not going to be relegated simply to those departments that have historically, and those units that have historically cared about them. And so to me, it's important to note that the Office of Information Technology, OIT, is really has really stepped up in this way to support what we're trying to do in terms of supporting student researchers in particular. And so, quick overview, again, that video link that we're going to share has a much deeper dive into this. But in 2020, the lab started essentially like a jobs program. I noticed all my students' internships and jobs for that summer, went up in flames. And so it was like, okay, how do we employ students but doing meaningful work, something that can last the whole summer? And so our first iteration, summer 2020, was what we call the pandemic portal. And the projects that grew out of that are all available on the lab website under the projects tab. And so the second iteration was thinking about how do we really partner with community organizations and let them lead the research. They bring the questions, we bring the human power and the support, and but the questions and the vision is led by our community partners rather than us coming up with things. And so we had some of that in the pandemic portal, certainly, but we were much more intentional about that starting in fall 2021. And again, the projects that grew out of that year, including working with this organization, Mi Gente, is on the projects tab. And then the next kind of layer that we saw how much capacity students had to formulate their own questions and to, as you'll see in the sessions at the conference, really be creative in how they're thinking about the futures that they want. It was, these student-led projects, one of which is here, the Liberatory Technology and Digital Marronage group and outcomes. And I've tweeted a little bit about that, so you can find some of the links related to that. And so this summer, is kind of the fourth iteration, we thought, okay, we really want to be more intentional about thinking about our work in terms of popular education. How can we learn from past generations? How can we adapt what our predecessors have done to the current context in which technology is so much a part of reinforcing and reflecting oppressive systems? And how can we combine a critical approach with a creative approach, knowing what we're against, critical, knowing what we're for, creative? And that's where the Tech Freedom School this summer sort of grew out of that. And we want to continue. We want to figure out how for this to expand, not that we are the center of it, but for other people to adopt and adapt. And so that we can all learn from each other, bring in high schoolers, bring in grandparents. I mean, one of the things that's been one of the most heartening things in speaking about race after technology is like just visiting public libraries and, having like a grandmother and a teenager in the same Zoom room talking about, the new Jim Code. And so part of what we want to really do is move beyond traditional sites and modes of learning and build on the Freedom School tradition. That last group, the Digital Marronage group, again, Kania and Peyton here in the picture, their ideas were profiled in this Boston Review piece. If someone could find the link and drop it in the chat. And for me, I love the framing here, how a new generation is combating digital surveillance and really thinking about those of us perhaps who've been working on these ideas and these fields for, a decade or more, how, the question that was posed in terms of how we see our role, I see it as creating containers and creating space for this new generation to really define the problems and define the futures that are more just and joyful. And so this is one example that combines the technical know-how, but most importantly, the critical and creative capacity to do this work. They are just one part of this much larger, larger movement, student-driven movement. Whether it's No Tech for Apartheid, which I know Amber Rahman was on an earlier part of the call, she might be here. If someone could find the No Tech for Apartheid, the student a wing of that growing movement, I think is one part of this. It involves students not going to work for companies that are involved, with the ICE, the work of ICE and other agents. It's thinking about how the student work is part of a much longer history, contrary to popular narratives. Organizing among technical workers has this vibrant history, including engineers and technicians in the 60s and 70s who fought professionalism, individualism, and reformism to contribute to radical labor organizing. Today, initiatives like Data for Black Lives, the Detroit Community Technology Project, the Immigrant Defense Project, offer an even more expansive approach, galvanizing communities to transform paranoia into power. And so they're taking a proactive approach to tech justice. And of course, needless to say, this is a global movement with digital justice organizers like Preta Lab, led by Sylvia Bahia, which focuses on Black women programmers and activists in Brazil. Perifa Code, an organization that works with young people living in the favelas. Quebradev, which organizes workshops and a podcast with the aim of democratizing technology and centering the experiences of Afro-Brazilians and people living in favelas. And Blogueiras Negras, which was one of the first hubs of Black digital activism in Brazil. And if we think about so many other regions of the world, in India, the Internet Freedom Foundation and the Arab Center for Social Media Advancement in Palestine, among many others. And there's more initiatives I could mention, including the incredible work by many of you at this conference. And so if you are doing something, you want to drop a link or a resource, please do, because in addition to the video recordings, usually the chat is also saved. And so it would be nice to get some of those names of initiatives and organizations that have convened here for this. The fact is, data disenfranchisement and domination is not entirely new and has always been met with resistance and appropriation, in which activists, scholars, and artists have sharpened abolitionist tools to advance human flourishing. This is a tradition in which, as Du Bois exclaimed, one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were being lynched, murdered, and starved. From his modernist data visualizations representing the facts of Black life on your left, to the Ida B. Wells Barnett's expert deployment of statistics in the Red Record on your right, there's a long tradition of employing and challenging data for justice. So this is my final proposition. If it is the case that inequity and injustice is woven into the very fabric of our society, we can see it from policing to preschool, we can see it in education and healthcare. No matter where you look, then each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problems that we're up against, though may feel overwhelming, are actually part of their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers. So what does that look like practically? For starters, I think it means focusing on everyday practices and pedagogies, on the fine print, the nitty gritty, those aspects of our work that we've been taught not to question. Just put your head down. It involves moving beyond tokenistic inclusion and predatory inclusion, remembering that process matters as much as the endpoint, thinking carefully about whose insights and experiences we're listening to and engaging. So if, as I suggested earlier on, the carceral imagination captures and contains robotic dogs, then a liberatory imagination can open up possibilities and pathways. It can create new settings, encode new values, and most importantly, build on critical intellectual traditions that have continuously developed insights and strategies grounded in justice. And my hope is that we all find ways to build on this tradition. Thank you so much for your attention, everyone. I wish we were in the same room together and could grab some snacks after, but this'll do until we can. Thank you so much for having me today. And I look forward to all of the sessions tomorrow.